Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
A bit of follow-up from our threading episode. One of the things I discussed was the precursor to the lead screw on a lathe for cutting threads accurately, and that was using a thread follower. And in that episode, I said that the thread follower was attached to the tool, and it isn't. That's how it's being used in a modern screw cutting lathe with a lead screw. The tool itself is what moves. In the case of the predecessor to it, the thread follower was actually attached to the headstock, and it would move the headstock back and forth. So that's something that a modern lathe shouldn't do. If your modern lathe does have a headstock that moves backwards and forwards, that's a problem, and you should get that fixed. But in earlier models, the thread follower was based on some of the ornamental engines that were out there, the ornamental lathes that were out there, and they had the ability to pump. They had a pumping action for the headstock, and so the thread follower was based partially on that. Anyways, that was attached to the headstock, not the tool. And then a bit of follow-up from last week's episode about the SI units, specifically the meter. I had talked about the definition being redefined using the wavelength of light, and that was the case at one point in the middle of the last century. However, that's been changed. Instead of using a wavelength of light, it has been changed to be based on the distance that light travels in a vacuum, and it's just shy of 300 millionths of a second, that distance. So that's what now defines the meter, since the speed of light in a vacuum shouldn't be changing anytime soon, and I suspect our universe is in trouble if that constant changes for some reason, because that's a sort of a fundamental constant of the universe. So hopefully it doesn't change, and hopefully the meter stays as it is. Originally, the meter was defined as 1/10 millionth of the distance from the pole to the equator as it ran through Paris. And it's a little unfortunate they decided to choose that particular system for designing the original meter. There was one proposal before they decided on that was going to base the meter on the length of a pendulum that had a period of 1 second. And I think that would have been absolutely beautiful. Would have been a far more elegant solution than this ridiculous measuring of distances across, long distances on the planet.
But the length of the pendulum changes based on where you are on the planet as well. So it throws some issues into things.
It's certainly not a perfect definition, but you could at least define the gravity constant in the area that you're working in. It's still not something that changes dramatically, whereas that distance between pole and equator actually does change quite a bit. So anyway, it has been fixed now. It is now based on a second. We'll be discussing SI units a little bit more next week when we talk about the Perfectionists. I've just about finished reading it. In fact, I'm in the chapter right now about SI units at the very end, and I know I have a lot to say about some of what he wrote about, and I'm sure you do as well. So we'll be talking about the Perfectionists on the next episode. So if you want to follow along with the Off Hours Book Club, you can find a copy of that wherever fine books are sold, and you can try and read it before the next episode.
So I've bought my first piece of art directly from an artist. This is kind of old hat for you. You've done this a number of times now.
Yeah.
Your house is a bona fide gallery of original art pieces.
Did you buy this from a gallery, or did you actually meet the artist at some kind of an art showing?
We actually met the artist. It's a Canadian artist who's based in Newfoundland. His name is Adam Young. He was in town for an exhibit this past weekend. I was showing off his work, and I couldn't quite afford the price tag on the original, but we did get one of 50 prints of this particular piece that my wife was quite fond of. And he was very nice to chat with him, and he very graciously signed the back of the canvas and wrote a little note to my wife, because this was a piece that she had her eyes on for a couple months now, since he had first completed it. It was a piece that he made this year. It's called the Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter #2. The first one he actually only sold the original of and did no prints of it. But there was so much demand for prints that he decided to do another one.
Yeah, excellent. It is always nice to be able to meet the artists when you're buying art. In fact, I don't know that I've ever purchased art where I didn't meet the artist originally.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know that I don't know if there's any pieces that we have in our house that we haven't. In fact, in many cases, the artist is a good friend, Stephen Strang, who we've spoken about before. I have a large collection of Strang, although I'm told that I do not have the largest collection of original Strangs. I did at one point, but I don't anymore. So I need to maybe step up my purchasing of his art the next time he's doing a show.
Well, your most recent acquisition is quite a handsome piece, and one of the larger Strangs that you've acquired, the Memory Thief, if memory serves me correctly.
Yeah, it's properly gargantuan for Steve's work. He tends to do little pieces, sort of 5x7 kind of sizes, and this one is 16x16, so it's quite large. We'll put an image of the painting up in the show notes. It certainly caught our attention, and I picked it up because I'm planning on putting it in my watchmaking studio when I finally finish working on that. I'm slowly collecting art that I want to put in there and use as inspiration. So I thought that this nice piece with an attractive pocket watch in it would be an appropriate item for my watch studio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you could probably fit a dozen or more of Strang's paintings in the span of the canvas we just acquired. It's not the biggest canvas that we have up on the wall. This is the first piece we've acquired directly from an artist, and from an artist who's still alive. We've got a couple of other pieces around the house, but they're all from artists who have long since passed on, like Fragonard and Caspar Davis Friedrich, and artists like that. But this is nice to be able to actually know who painted what's up on the wall, and to have been able to shake his hand and hear him recount firsthand what was behind it and what went into it.
Absolutely, and I know I've had a number of people ask me about buying art because they come over to the house and they see that we have a sizable collection of art. And I will say that if you can buy art directly from the artist, it does make a big difference. If you're buying through a gallery, the gallery does take a significant percentage of the sale. So if you can buy directly from the artist, I always recommend doing that. Also, you get the advantage of speaking to the artist and meeting them, hopefully, and being able to chat with them. And then they know as well that that you're supporting them and you appreciate what they do. So that's always nice as well. Yeah, the other thing I'll say about art and collecting art, because people will talk about how much art is worth, and honestly, art is worth what you think it's going to be worth. It's not something that's worth buying assuming that it's going to go up in value. You have to purchase it assuming that it will be yours forever and that you will never resell it, and that you have to enjoy it. So if you don't enjoy a piece, don't buy it. It's not worth it, regardless of how much it's worth or how much you think it may be worth one day. Don't buy it based on that. Buy it based on the fact that you love the work and that you're interested in looking at it every day. Yeah, go out there and find interesting artists that are in your area, because there's some stunning artwork out there, and it is certainly worthwhile collecting.
Mm-hmm. And Strang's pieces have a nice whimsical quality to them. And I find Young's do as well, though it's in his own way. They certainly differ, the two of them. But it's nice to be able to see them all first hand, and you did have a couple of originals there too, and being able to see the brush strokes rising up away from that canvas, it's always a nice treat. I really enjoy being able to take a close look at the brushwork anytime I'm visiting a gallery that has originals up on the walls.
I wasn't familiar with his work before you mentioned him, and I see the piece that you picked up on there, and I like that. I like his style. I like the boldness of color that he's chosen, and the as well as you said, his whimsical style. So yeah, that's nice. I like the work that he's doing.
Yeah, he's definitely done a good job of capturing some of that East Coast charm. Now, we did chat a bit about Strang's work back on episode 9. We'll be sure to link to it again in the show notes for this episode. But another tidbit of information to refer back to from a previous episode that's worth touching on is the news that PrinterBot is officially closed down. This is quite sudden. Back in episode 15, when we talked about 3D printers, I mentioned that the PrinterBot Play was the first 3D printer that I ever purchased. And unfortunately, the company is no longer in business.
Yeah, that is quite sudden. It's unfortunate. There are a bunch of people out there I know who are looking for parts for that. So that's unfortunate that all of a sudden they're disappeared, and I wonder if somebody's going to come in and fill that space with replacement parts for their printers. But have you decided if you're going to try and sort of struggle along with the printer bot you have, or are you going to replace it with something else?
So I've gone ahead and there was a sale on some other printers this past weekend. So I picked up another entry level printer, which I expect to be receiving in the next couple of weeks, and we'll see how it is once I actually get it and get it set up.
Oh, good.
But I imagine the Play would still be able to run just fine for me for a good number of years, and there are still some parts kicking around out there. And I may hang on to it as a backup, or more than likely sell it while it still has some value. We'll see. And as far as someone coming up and filling the void that they've left, this is something I've talked about with some other people this past week too. And one of them mentioned to me that it's quite tough to manufacture something like that within the United States at the price they were selling it at, and still be able to turn a profit and stay afloat. So I would imagine that it's not going to be leaving much of a vacuum to be filled by another company who'd be operating out of the States, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that we're losing an inexpensive printer from the market, but I'm sure that it will be filled quite quickly, because there doesn't seem to be a lack of printers at the low end of the market right now.
Mm-hmm. And you've been working with your printer quite a bit this past week too. What have you been up to there?
Yeah, I've been struggling a little bit over the last couple of months. I wasn't particularly happy with the accuracy that I was getting out of it. Accuracy in terms of dimensions. One of the differences between the printer that you're using and the one I'm using is that mine is being driven by a UV projector. Think about the same kind of projector that you would use for your computer, projecting it onto the wall, that kind of thing. Except in this case, instead of doing colored projection, it's just using UV light to cure the resin that's in the tank. And it's adjustable in terms of the focus point of that projector. And so you have to sort of fiddle around with it a little bit and get the focus exactly right to sort of get that down. And I was struggling a little bit with getting that down properly. So I spent the day yesterday and part of today basically just going in and printing out some of my lugs and measuring the models that I was printing out and making sure that I was getting accurate prints. And so after a few test prints, I was able to sort of dial it in so that it's pretty close. It's within 0.3 millimeters of what I'm looking for. And that's close enough, I think, for what I'm doing, because I'm probably going to get a little bit of shrinkage from my casting process as well, because the resin that I'm using. So it's a little bit oversized, a little bit of shrinkage in casting. I think it should work out pretty well. So we'll see what happens, and I should be casting the first versions of the lugs in the case next week in silver. So hopefully that goes well, and hopefully I can take advantage of this printer for casting these lugs or printing the lugs and then casting them.
Nice. It's good that you're able to still be able to salvage or work with the lugs despite being off by 0.3 of a millimeter. I had a terrible time. Well, I shouldn't say terrible time. It took me a few attempts this week to make a particular part. I was making for a watch movement, and I was off by 0.03 on my first attempt, and that just it wasn't going to fly. I had to make it again.
One of the advantages of doing casework versus doing actual movement work is the casework is a little bit more forgiving. And in this case, I'll be milling slots into the center band of the watch to drop these lugs into. And I won't be milling those slots until I have the actual cast piece from the lugs, and then I can take the dimensions straight off of that instead of taking the ideal dimensions that I've modeled and that I've put in my drawings. So there are advantages to doing casework like this, where you can machine the parts to the actual part that you have, as opposed to just blindly needing to go on exact dimensions that you're working to. So that's one of the advantages of it.
As Philippe Dufour is renowned for doing, he actually has the cases made before he even cuts the main plate for the movement that's going to be going
Sure.
inside of the case, because he'll cut the main plate to be a precise fit inside of the case, down to the 100th of a millimeter.
Wow. That's interesting that he's chosen to go that way. I would have gone the other way, but I'm mostly because I think the case is a little bit more expendable in terms of the dimensions. So I'm a little surprised he's done that. I would have probably cut the main plates and had those all cut accurately, and then take the case and do a final turn on that inside diameter to make sure that it fits properly. That's interesting.
Well, unlike the approach that you're taking, where you're using an off-the-shelf movement and then crafting the case, Dufour's specialty is in the movement making side of things, and he actually has other specialists that he relies on for making the cases and the dials and things like that for his watches. So he'll get a shipment of cases in from a case maker, and then make the movements bespoke to fit the actual case.
Yeah, I guess if you're not doing any of the work on the case, it's easier to do it that way. You can rely on them to have turned the cases to at least a consistent accuracy amongst themselves, and then cut your main plates from there. This is one of the advantages of being able to do all of this yourself, is that you can sort of pick and choose where you're fighting those battles, and you don't have to rely on somebody else to do that, which is nice.
On an entirely different scale of cutting and precision, while I was checking out the artistic works of paint on canvas this past weekend, you were out walking the streets and observing the work of an entirely different breed of craftsmen. What is it you got up to this past weekend?
Oh, something I've been meaning to check out for a few years now is the Canadian Stone Carving Festival. And this is something that came to my attention a number of years ago. I started chatting with Phil White online at one of the forums that I'm on. And Phil White is the current Dominion sculptor. And the Dominion sculptor is the person responsible for the overseeing and directing and executing many of the stone carvings up on Parliament Hill. And this is a position that was created probably 100 years ago when they were rebuilding the Parliament buildings after a massive fire. And somebody realized that there was a need for sort of an architect and a guiding hand in carving the stone. And so when they were rebuilding it, they had somebody who was sort of creating that vision of what the stone should look like. And they also made sure that there was a number of blank spots left on the building where future artists could put their own work and sort of continue the history of Canada in stone. And so I found out about this Canadian Stone Carving Festival through Phil many years ago. And unfortunately, it's always been on a weekend when I've been out of town or I've been unavailable to go down. But they hold it down on Spark Street, which is one of our pedestrian malls in Ottawa. And they usually have anywhere from, I think, a dozen to 20 stone carvers who come out. And the idea is that it starts on Friday morning, ends on Sunday afternoon, and they're each given a block of stone. It's Indiana limestone that they're given. And using nothing but hand tools, they have 18 hours to carve a design into the stone. So it was kind of fun. We got to check it out at the end near when everybody was finished. And it turns out that Tamara knew one of the artists that was there. He's a calligrapher as well, so she knows him through the calligraphy world. And we had a chance to see what these artists were doing. There were people there who had as little as 6 months worth of experience, and others who had more than 40 years worth of experience doing it. And again, some of them were purely there for as a hobby. They were just doing it for fun. Others are professionals. In fact, some of them were people who do work on a daily basis up on Parliament Hill, doing restoration work and original carvings for the Parliament building. It was an interesting experience. It's nice to see a different scale of art than what I do, and a different permanence level than some of the stuff that I do.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. I had no idea that that is an event that took place here in the capital, despite having lived very near Spark Street for a number of years.
Yeah. We're quite fortunate in Ottawa because of the Parliament buildings and because of the active restoration work, as well as the active new work that's being done on the buildings. There is a huge community of stone carvers here in Ottawa, comparatively. And in fact, I believe there's more stone carvers here in Ottawa than there are anywhere else in Canada, and just because of the active restoration work. I know this was a problem in the UK for a while. There was a huge demand for skilled carvers, skilled stone carvers, because many of them had retired or died off. So I know there's been an active attempt to increase the number of talented stone carvers, or qualified stone carvers, I should say, in the UK. It's nice to see such a thriving community here, and there is certainly a thriving community, including a school where you can learn to stone carve here in Ottawa. Over the years, I've sort of mused with the idea of trying my hand at stone carving. So who knows? Maybe I'll take a class and give it a chance. It's certainly a different scale than what I'm used to working on, and it would be I think it would be kind of fun.
I tried my hand at it with an air hammer in my youth, and couldn't really feel my limbs very well the next day. What sort of tools were they using?
They were using purely hammer and chisel. There was no power tools being used at all. It was all being done with hand tools. So yeah, that's and files and sandpaper as well. But yeah, I'm not sure that I would want to do this with power tools. I like the idea of, it's certainly still not a quiet art doing it with hand tools, but it doesn't have the level of violence that the power tools have when it comes to working on stone.
So a number of them must have forearms like longbow archers.
Well, I'm not sure. A lot of it shouldn't require a huge amount of strength to do. You should be able to do it with precision and a sharp tool, as opposed to just pure power. Sort of like a blacksmith, right? We have this idea in our minds of a blacksmith who has massive arms, but if a blacksmith is working smart, they shouldn't necessarily need to have huge, powerful arms when they're working. You should be able to work and without a huge amount of power. And I think the same goes for stone carving. I think if you're trying to overpower the stone, you're probably going to fail at a lot of it and probably hurt yourself.
The most blacksmiths I know of today who are working in any real professional capacity tend to use pneumatic hammers too, which definitely makes the job a lot easier.
Yeah, certainly, and that's being done mostly for speed. It's and also because as I've discussed in my own work, getting apprentices is something that's very difficult to do nowadays. So the power hammer basically takes the place of the apprentice, and so for some of the forge welding techniques and the larger structural pieces, you do need to use something a bit bigger. But yeah, it's mostly for speed and to replace unskilled labor, as it were.
Now, a couple of shows ago, I was razzing you a little bit about your Apple Watch and the fact that you were building a more anachronistic watch of your own, and how you could possibly resolve this is within your own mind, and sort of the mental gymnastics you'd be going through to justify making a mechanical watch while still sporting the Apple Watch. And a very ardent Apple Watch wearer who you've alluded to, I think we've talked about in previous episodes from Cortex, is Mike Hurley. And interestingly enough, shortly after that episode aired where I was razzing you a bit, he admitted to having taken his Apple Watch off his wrist and supplanted it with a Nomos for quite a number of months now.
Yeah.
And I just thought there were a lot of interesting parallels there between what we had discussed and what Mike and CGP Grey discussed as well. And I agreed with pretty much everything the two of them said and hashed out. And there's certainly a balance to be had there. But I was wondering what your thoughts were on that when you caught that episode.
Yeah, it was funny listening to Mike talk about that so soon after we had discussed it. And he had given up he had abandoned his Apple Watch earlier than I have. Although, to be fair, I've been wearing a watch most of my life of some kind, and obviously most of that time has not been an Apple Watch, and in fact the majority of the time it's been a various mechanical watches. So Wearing a mechanical watch is certainly not something new for me when I do go back to wearing one. The Apple Watch is still probably going to be a blip on the radar in terms of the amount of time that I spend with a watch on my hand or on my wrist. But yes, with Mike, I agree with a lot of what he said to say. I agreed a lot with his struggles of changing his notifications from his watch to his phone. He had done the same thing that I had done, where he had moved nearly all of his notifications off of his phone and onto his watch. Only the important things ended up going to his watch. And it certainly meant that he was looking at his phone less often, and that's something that I found. And when he started using a mechanical watch solely, he was having a little bit of sort of shock in terms of going back to the notifications on his phone and how often he was looking at it. So that was it was an interesting discussion, and it was nice to listen to somebody else who's sort of going through the same struggles as I am in terms of deciding which way to go. And he is still planning on using it for fitness tracking, which is something that I intend to do as well. And I may still double watch it. We'll see. I'm not sure. May put my Apple Watch on my right wrist and a mechanical watch on my left wrist. We'll see how that goes. It would be nice if the Apple Watch was a little bit thinner than it is now to be able to do that. I think it's a little bit awkward now with to be doing two watches at the size that it is. But it's certainly a worthwhile episode to listen to in terms of how somebody who is enjoying the mechanical side of things is also, interested in the tech side of things as well. And he said that he hasn't, sworn off of the Apple Watch completely. He may still come back to it, and I suspect he probably will when anyone comes out. He'll, at the very least, experiment with it and see if it's something that he wants to use. And I suspect I will probably do the same thing, and I will probably have the Apple Watch as something that I sort of wear semi-regularly as opposed to all the time now.
Yeah, I found it interesting that the one big use case that you both really wouldn't be able to part with the Apple Watch for was actually swimming links in the pool. That seems to be the one activity that it has really served a big use case for in both your lives.
Yeah, I know a number of people who have things like Fitbits or equivalent fitness trackers, and I've looked into them, but I've never been particularly impressed with their ability to track what you're doing. The Apple Watch just has so many advantages in terms of its computing power, the sensors that are built into it, and then probably the most important thing, its tight integration into iOS and your phone. So it's something that I use regularly when I'm at the gym, when I'm working out, whether it's running, cycling, swimming, doesn't matter what it is. I'm regularly using my Apple Watch for that. The other thing that he mentioned that was painful that he was noticing without it was using Apple Pay. And I tend to use Apple Pay off my phone more than my watch while I'm here in Ottawa, and while I'm most stores I tend to use my phone versus my watch. But his use case that he was missing was using the Apple Pay from his watch in the London Underground. It is so nice to be able to just walk up to a turnstile, double click the button on your watch. You don't even have to look at it. You just have to put your wrist down on the sensor as you're walking through. Beep, it tags your phone, or it tags your card. And then when you leave again, it's the same thing. Just tap your watch on the carousel as you're going out, and you don't have to deal with it. You don't have to deal with a card. You don't have to deal with anything. So I would certainly miss that. And I think, I don't know if I've mentioned it before on this show, but I've certainly mentioned it to friends before. I still think the Apple Watch is probably the most significant travel gadget I have ever used. Like it's been the most beneficial travel gadget I've ever used. When you're in a city that you don't know, the ability to send directions to your watch and have it tap your wrist to tell you which way to turn as you're walking around a city is so revolutionary and eye-opening.
Absolutely.
It allows you the freedom to wander a little bit off of the beaten path. You're not sitting there staring at your phone or a map or whatever as you're walking around. You get to sort of experience the city a little bit more and be able to see and enjoy the city quite a bit more as you're walking around. I know when I've walked around Kyoto with it, or Tokyo, or even London, somewhere like that, if it's a place that you don't know very well, being able to say, I want to get to this destination point, being able to just sort of take a left turn because that street looks interesting is so liberating when you're walking around. So I suspect that even with a mechanical watch that I build, when I travel, I'm probably going to keep my Apple Watch handy. Everything from directions to Apple Pay to even notifications about airlines. When you're flying, gate changes happen regularly, or there might be delays in a plane or whatever. Having those notifications go straight to your watch is certainly advantageous. There are still benefits to having it, and I would be surprised if I ever get rid of an Apple Watch completely. But its use will certainly be curtailed by having a nice mechanical watch again.
Yeah, I can certainly see both sides of the coin. One thing I admire about what Mike said as well is this, that he admits like this is where he's currently at. This is current Mike is enjoying wearing his Nomos, and that may change in the future. Like we are always changing and adapting, and our tastes and our priorities change over time. And right now, this is where he's at, and he's enjoying wearing the Nomos, throwing the Apple Watch on when he goes in the pool, and just kind of juggling things that way.
I've never understood people who categorically say that they refuse to ever try using something like an Apple Watch. There are benefits to it, and there are certainly benefits to wearing it all the time. I mean, Apple has certainly designed it in such a way that there is a benefit to having it on your wrist all the time. If you're interested in sort of tracking your life and tracking what you're doing, there certainly are benefits to that, and also not just from a tracking point of view, but from a notification point of view and integration, control over music and podcasts and things like that off your phone. There are huge benefits to doing that, wearing it all the time. But certainly there is a benefit to having it around. It's certainly worth trying for most people, whether you do wear a mechanical watch most of the time or not. There certainly are use cases where having an Apple Watch, having some sort of a connected device on your wrist is beneficial. And I think until we have a better wearable device, again, something like glasses or something like that, which give you a better interface to seeing the world and interacting with the world through your phone, I think the watch is still the best sort of option. In fact, in a lot of ways, I would probably give up my phone if the watch was a little bit more reliable and had some sort of expanded features and expanded performance. The larger device of the phone actually drives me nuts, and I think that having something a little bit smaller would be beneficial.
Interesting. Unpack that for me. What are some of the key features the watch would need to adopt for you to be able to feel comfortable leaving your phone behind?
I think a slightly better interface in terms of reading what's going on. I think that when it comes to notifications and stuff like that, what you're seeing on screen is often a little bit too limited. You're not getting quite as much as you get on a notification on the lock screen, for instance, in many cases. So I would want to see a little bit more of that. Also, the ability to reply to notifications from the watch is limited, mostly because the applications aren't running directly on the watch. So, for instance, if there was something like Tweetbot or Facebook Messenger or something like that, or iMessage, it is running. You can get it straight on the watch, but many of these other apps where I would be using it for receiving notifications or maybe replying to something or seeing something like a calendar event or something like that, or maybe finding a destination that I'm trying to get to through maps. Those are all still pretty limited right now, primarily due to storage constraints on the device, processor constraints, and mostly due to the thermal envelope of the device. The CPU can't really run as fast as it they would like it to, and of course, the faster the CPU is running, the harder that is on the battery. So there are a lot of limitations of it right now. It's still pretty early on in the development of the device, but I think as we start to see faster processors in there, as we see more storage in there, it already has LTE capability now, so it has always-on connectivity to the internet. That's one of the key things that it was missing. So I think as we start to see more applications running directly on the watch itself, it will become something that could actually replace the phone. Because to be honest, most of the time, the things that I'm interested in on my phone are, I'm reading something like Twitter or Instagram or something like that, and I don't necessarily need to do that on a phone. In fact, most cases I would much rather be doing it on an iPad on a larger screen than what my phone does. But that phone is still pretty large, and I still have to carry it in my pocket, and it's still awkward, and I would still much rather have something smaller that's a little bit less awkward to carry around.
Now, while I agreed with pretty much everything that Gray and Mike had to say concerning his move to the Nomos from the Apple Watch, one area that I am not in agreement on is the way he's handling the notifications from the phone and not having any sort of custom tap tones or ringtones set up for the various alerts, because that's something that I find incredibly beneficial on the phone, is having custom alerts. And so I have custom text tones set up for my wife and for friends and family. So if a particular buzz goes off in my pocket, I know whether it's something I want to address right away, or whether it's something that is just a generic text I happen to have gotten from something that isn't a priority, so not something I need to drop what I'm doing and pull my phone out to check out. And it's just really changed the way that I interact with my device ever since I set those up a few years ago.
Yeah, I agree completely. The custom notifications are a total game changer if you are relying on your phone as your primary source of notification. There are so many notifications coming into our devices, and if you have no way of being able to distinguish between them, it can be frustrating, and you certainly would be looking at your phone a lot more than you need to. I know I mentioned before one of the biggest advantages for me of going to the Apple Watch is the fact that I can put critical notifications to my watch instead of having them go only to my phone. I know that if my phone buzzes and my watch doesn't, I know that it's not a particularly important message or a particularly important notification, so I can ignore it if I'm in the middle of doing something else. So for instance, if I'm having lunch with somebody or I'm having dinner with somebody or whatever, and my watch buzzes, I at least look at it to see if it's something that I have to take care of right away. If my phone buzzes and I'm at dinner, I completely ignore it. There is nothing that's going to buzz my phone during dinner, but not my watch, that I need to care about. So yeah, the way of getting around that is custom notifications, and I think that's something that if you struggle with your notifications right now, if you find yourself either frustrated with the number of notifications you're getting that you look at that you don't necessarily need to look at, or you're just sort of overwhelmed with them, or you want to be able to distinguish them better, the custom tapping, the custom buzzing is definitely something that you need to look at.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference in quality of life. And there are physiological effects to every time your phone dings or buzzes. You actually have a hormonal response to that, and it'll light up your adrenal gland. And being able to know exactly what that alert is, or curtailing alerts down to a minimum. I have very few alerts that actually will come through on my phone and notify me. And I have quite a few that just flat out ignore it. There's an interesting documentary episode from the BBC, Panorama, I will link to in the show notes too, that actually shows someone, the reporter who was working on the documentary, or the expose, I guess you could say, about smartphones. They actually hooked her up to a machine and had her focus on a particular activity, and they had taken her phone away and set it just behind her. And without telling her, one of the people running the experiment was texting her in the background. And then afterwards, they showed her the graph of her cortisol levels basically spiking every time the phone buzzed.
Interesting.
And that the actual anxiety inducing effect that it had, and just how much it peaked by the end of the exercise that she was engaging in. It was eye-opening.
Yeah, I know years ago when I was in the IT industry doing on-call work regularly, I was in a job at one point where I was on call every second week, and we were getting active calls on a regular basis. And after I left that job, it took nearly 9 months for me to stop waking up in the middle of the night and not, freaking out that I hadn't heard my phone. I had thought, my brain was sitting there saying, okay, you haven't heard a page. What's wrong? Why haven't you heard a page? Did you miss it? And it took nearly 9 months for me to stop waking up like that and stop reacting to the lack of something. I'd also regularly get phantom buzzes on my hip where I used to carry my pager. So it's amazing how quickly your brain adapts to that kind of thing and how it reacts to it. So Obviously, reducing notifications is something that's important if you can, and I think that leads into some of the things that is happening in iOS 12. And I know this is something that Mike and Gray talked a little bit about in the show because they've both been running the beta of iOS 12, and I've been running the beta on both my Carry phone and my iPad over the last month or so. I'm on the public beta, and some of the new features that are available in terms of notifications on iOS 12 are certainly going to make this easier. Everything from the ability to change how a notification works the instant it comes in. So if you see a notification come up from Facebook, you can click on it and change the way that all notifications from Facebook react. You don't have to go into settings now to go and dig through and find the settings, in particular for Facebook, and try and figure it out. So you can say, deliver this quietly from now on, and you don't ever have to deal with notifications from Facebook buzzing you or whatever. So there are a few things like that in iOS 12 that I'm finding are really pleasant for how you deal with notifications, and certainly a huge improvement over previous versions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a big improvement there. It makes it much simpler for just about anyone to be able to better manage and toggle the way that notifications are handled on the phone. It offers a finer grain of control too, which is nice. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think so one of the features that people should really look at if they're on iOS and they're getting into once iOS 12 becomes publicly available, I don't recommend that you get the beta, but come the end of September when the full release comes out, the GA release comes out, one of the features that's really nice is the ability to turn on Do Not Disturb, based on, and have it end based on different criteria. So I have a Do Not Disturb set up, and this is something I had in iOS 11. If you go into your clock app and you look at the bedtime option, you can have Do Not Disturb automatically come on at a certain time and automatically turn off at a different time, which is nice. That's a nice feature, so you know that you're not going to get notifications in the middle of the night. But now you have the option to say, do not disturb until the end of this calendar event. So if if you've got, for instance, you're recording a podcast and you have that podcast in your calendar, then you can say, don't disturb me until the end of this calendar event. Or if it's a meeting that you're in or whatever, then it won't disturb you. You won't get any notifications at all until that calendar event finishes. You can also set it up based on where you're located. So for instance, if you're out at dinner, you can say, do not disturb until I leave this location. And so it doesn't matter how long dinner is, until you leave that location, you won't start getting any notifications. So certain things like that are really nice. The do not disturb feature, I know, is one that a lot of people have avoided using because they didn't necessarily know whether they had do not disturb turned on, and they had turned it on and they had forgotten to turn it off, and so they weren't getting notifications when they wanted to. That's certainly been improved a lot, and it's worthwhile experimenting with in the new version, just because it is a lot more powerful than it used to be, and certainly has some advantages over the previous versions.
And just to wrap up, I think it's worth touching on how to set up the custom per contacts ringtones and text tones for anyone who does want to do that, because it's not necessarily the most obvious thing. But if you just drop into the contacts app and then hit the edit button on the contact you want to add a custom tone for, I'll actually do this live, so that if you want to walk along with me, you can do the same thing. You just drop in and say, I want to set a custom text tone for someone. I can go in and pick from all the various audible tones that there are there, but you can also set a custom vibration tone by hitting vibration, and they have a bunch that are already set up. But then you can also create your own vibration, and then by tapping on the screen in any pattern or frequency that you like, you can actually create your very own custom tap tone that you would receive for a particular contact, whether they happen to be calling you or sending you a message. And I found that really just changed the way that I interact with my device when it's in my pocket. Definitely worth optimizing at least a few contacts for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the last thing I wanted to talk about with iOS 12, and there's a few new features that are in there in terms of being able to monitor how much time you're spending on your device, specifically screen time. And this is a great new feature where it tells you how many hours a week you're using particular applications, how many times you're picking up your phone every day, You're also seeing things about how many notifications you're getting. So it's telling me that across my phone and my iPad, Kindle, Tweetbot, and Instagram are the 3 most used apps that I have, which isn't surprising. I'm getting most of my notifications from iMessage, and and it's telling me how often that I'm picking up my device. So those are all useful things if you're interested in sort of how much you're actually using your device and how much it's affecting you. That can give you some good insight into what's going on. And if you're interested in trying to curtail the use of certain things, you can also use a setting called downtime to change the amount of time that's available for an app during the day. So for instance, you can say, all right, I want to be able to use Facebook for only 1 hour a day. And so it will keep track of how often you're using Facebook. And once you've used Facebook for an hour that day, it will then come up and say, sorry, but you've used Facebook for more than your allotted time. If you want to bypass this, there's a button that you can use to bypass it for 15 minutes. But if you don't click on that button, then you won't be able to use Facebook again until the next day. So, and you won't be getting any notifications from Facebook in that case. It's almost as if the app has been uninstalled off your phone. So I think downtime is something that will be useful for a lot of people in terms of being able to control how much they're using certain apps if they're finding they spend too much time in certain places. And if you're a parent trying to keep track of your kids' use of of an iOS device, then there's ways of setting that up as a parent so that you can control how much time they have. So you can say that they have unlimited access to education and reading apps, but they only have an hour a day in games. And so you can control it based on a category as well. You don't have to necessarily specify per application how much time they've got. So yeah, there are a few features in there that I think are going to be good for people's well-being and health when it comes to how they interact with their phones between the notifications and do not disturb and screen time. I think there are going to be ways of people being able to have a healthier relationship with their phone, which is always good.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. The show notes for this episode will be up at offhours.show/EP22. And you can always feel free to send us an email or use the contact form on the site to send along any questions or feedback that you have to hello@offhours.show. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.